Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Dr. John Mueller. Hello, John. How are you doing?
Pretty well.
So, John, today we're going to talk about your views on China. I read your article published by the Cato Institute titled China, Rise or Demise, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's awesome. So, John, this is the first question. Does China pose a geopolitical threat?
Not in my view. It does not have any real territorial ambitions of expansion a la Hitler. It does want to play a larger role on the world stage. It certainly wants to continue developing, and it has various problems internally that it wants to solve. But I do not think it poses what could be called a security threat, particularly to the United States, or pretty much to anybody else, with the exception, obviously, of its desire to retake Taiwan.
All right. John, yesterday my guest was Ambassador David Shin, and Ambassador Shin served the US in Burkina Faso and in other countries in Africa. And during the interview, Ambassador Shin noted that China's investments in Africa are exaggerated. And we during the article, we shared many articles and data to support this conclusion. So basically, even in Africa, the rise of China is somewhat embellished.
Yes, it's not the rise anyway. All they're doing is investing in various things. And if those things turned out to work, great. If not, not. This is all part of their Belt and Road Initiative. And it does not seem, even though President Xi sees it as a major achievement, this is not working out very well. For example, in about 4 years ago, they were investing about $75 billion a year. Last year, it was down to about 5 billion, sort of suggesting they're running into problems. But what they're trying to do is get influence. They're not trying to take over Africa. If they get some influence, so what? People listen to them, people won't listen to them. It's not a security threat.
The Chinese want to serve as a counterbalance to US hegemony in Africa and other parts of the developing world. I agree with you, John. China does not have serious imperial ambitions. Based on my readings, it appears that the Chinese actually want to contain the reach of America in some parts of the world. Am I correct?
Well, they might, yes, it's certainly like the United States to retreat some from its naval presence, in particular in the Far East, and in the South China Sea and so forth. Since those are not terribly important issues, it seems to me it's not that important. Also, by the way, the whole idea, both in this article you mentioned out of Cato and also in my recent book called The Stupidity of War.
John, we're going to talk about the stupidity of war at the end of the interview.
Okay, fine. Well, in both places, I find it very difficult to figure out what the word hegemony means. If it means dominance, and the United States is a hegemon in the Western Hemisphere, it hasn't had very much success with dominating Cuba, for example, for the last half century or more, nor can it do much about what's going on in Venezuela. So if it doesn't mean dominance, then the word hegemony basically doesn't mean anything, it seems to me. It's just a useless word and an exceedingly unhelpful word.
Some ascribe realism to delineate America's foreign policy, but I believe that the preferable term is liberal realism. So for example, Americans are less interested in Africa because Africa is not strategically important to American interests. Liberal realism in the sense that the Americans care about countries based on the prospects of geopolitical threat and risk, not necessarily because Americans do have a vested interest in exporting democracy. This is just a shield for US imperialism.
I don't know what that means either. It's imperialism. You just mentioned that the United States is not very imperialistic. It's not taking over the countries. There used to be a word for that, which was colonialism, which you'd actually go in and take over and try to control the country. The United States isn't even trying to do that in Iraq and Afghanistan. It wants to get out and is obviously doing it right now in Afghanistan. So I don't see that imperialism means anything any more than influence means much of anything, any more than hegemony means much of anything. If that means we have to abandon international relations theory, that's just fine with me.
Yeah, but John, when was the last time a country exerted real power in international relations other than when Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine?
He didn't invade
No, sorry, you
Ukraine.
invade annexed.
Well, he oversaw a vote in which overwhelming majority of the people who voted to join Russia. Is very similar to what happened in Kosovo in 1999, when the parliament, not the people, decided to secede from Serbia, and the United States supported that secession movement. It does not support the one that Putin put together. It's been mostly hypocrisy. I can talk more about the whole Ukrainian issue. It's basically a basket case nation and was basically falling apart. There's a rise of neo-Nazis in many places, which I think are much exaggerated in the Russian perception, but nonetheless understandably alarming to them.
Yeah, for my information on Russia, one of the writers I read frequently was Stephen Cohen, and I do agree with him to an extent. Russia has a different realm of influence, and Ukraine and other countries in Central Asia and Eastern Europe do fall within that realm of influence. And as someone who subscribes to a multipolar world, I don't have a problem if Russia decides to assist or intervene in a country, provided that the citizens agree with Russian influence, like you mentioned earlier with Ukraine. The truth is that Russia is not a part of the philosophical or political West.
Well, it could become one. It was moving in that direction under Yeltsin, but obviously didn't let it. They're going to play. They're going to play around. They want to be able to do things in their area. One possibility right now is they're going to help out essentially with the disaster that's in Afghanistan. They'll make them feel good, and if they do good, fine. Russia also intervened in the war, such as it was between Azerbaijan and Armenia just shortly a couple of years ago. And they basically worked out a peace agreement, which is, better for one side than the other, but so is the war. And if they want to do that, if they can help out in those cases, fewer people are being killed. There's an uneasy peace that's settled over the area. And if they want to play a role in international politics, that's fine. Another case where we ought to be working with the Russians right now is in Syria. Assad has won in Syria. We have to give up with supporting these various hundreds or even thousands of little groups that seem to want to secede at one time. The country is now under Assad's control again. And it seems to be that the United States and Russia should be working side by side to try to make that place a relatively stable and productive place to be, as it was before the Civil War issue came up. So in general, having the Chinese, having the Russians work on certain international problems, the Chinese can also potentially be helpful with Afghanistan. Neither of those strike me as being a terrible thing.
And John, should we worry about America's trade deficit with China? Recently, I read an article, and I even wrote an article on the topic arguing that in terms of technology, China is still a laggard. China is a laggard in 5G technology. And when we examine intellectual property trade, the Americans have a surplus and the Chinese have a deficit. The Chinese, their intention is to improve American technology. And in my conversations with serious economists who study innovation, they often say to me, okay, people worry about the rise of China. They're wary of China's ascent. But what are the Chinese inventing?
Yeah, I think that's basically true. That's in my field or anything. Their educational system is one in which mediocrity is praised much higher and benefits people much better than unsettling unorthodoxy. So I think they're riding for something of a fall or a decline. But on the other hand, if the rise of China simply means it gets richer, so what? They'll have more to buy and more to sell. They can buy more of our debt. I mean, it's not a security threat. Right now, China is now, I think, in per capita GDP ranks about number 78. It's got a long way to go before it even enters what used to be called the developed world. Basically, if the United States can help and prosper and profit from China, as it does many times in its rating system, that strikes me as being perfectly okay. I don't see that if China turns around and starts inventing stuff, what the hell's wrong with that? Now, if they can invent a better light bulb or a better internet connection or a better solar panel, that strikes me as being something that they would want to sell and something we might very much want to buy. It doesn't strike me as being an act of hegemony or a failure on the part of the United States. It's part of the game.
And I'm in favor of pro trade, especially because I live in a small country, and Chinese trade for the most part has been good for American citizens. David Henderson has excellent work on the topic. We benefit from Chinese trade in the form of increased savings and leisure time. So I don't have a problem with a rise in China. Historically, we should actually fear a China that's declining. When countries believe that they're about to decline, they become more aggressive.
Well, I'm not sure they become more aggressive, but they can certainly become more problematic. But I agree with that. Basically, a really collapsing China would be a real danger, a real problem, bigger problem than its peaceful, gradual economic rise.
And John, should we also be concerned about demographics in China? Some argue that by the 2030s, China will be doing worse than American all demographic fronts. Therefore, if demography will negatively impact China's rise in the future, should we really be that concerned about China, even if she becomes more aggressive?
I don't think she's going to become more aggressive. She isn't particularly, except with respect to the issue of Taiwan. I do think that the Chinese are well aware of it. They do have a huge demographic problem. By the 2050 or something, it'll be one working person for every elderly person. That's going to be a really bad ratio. But they're trying to deal with it. They changed their policy. They're trying to go to automation and so forth. But we'll have to see if that works. But it is a real problem, definitely.
Yes, one writer for Foreign Policy magazine writes, officially, China's demographic situation is nothing to be alarmed about. The 2020 census showed that China's population reached the expected level of 1.41 billion people in 2020 and continued to grow. And yet, less than a month after the census was released, Chinese authorities announced the loosening of family planning rules so that households can have 3 children rather than 2. They have now also put forward a comprehensive plan for boosting the fertility rate. So based on what this writer is saying, demography could pose a problem, but the Chinese are taking steps to avert a demographic collapse.
Yes, I think so. And whether that'll work or not, I don't know. Chinese women, like women everywhere, seem to be having fewer babies no matter what, including countries that have no ban on number of children. So it's not clear that, and raising a child is very expensive. Chinese are trying to do something about that, make it cheaper so therefore people have more babies. They also seem to want really the people to have babies are the ones in the cities, not the ones in the rural areas, which are mostly very poorly educated and very poor, which is why their GDP per capita is so low. So they've got a problem there, and that it may be working out. It's not clear that we could or should or do anything about it. It's a problem. Other countries have a similar problem. For example, Japan, though Japan is obviously much better healed, much better off per capita than China can potentially handle it. But the Japanese, don't have a ban, but women in China and in Japan are not having very many babies, and it's not clear to me that's going to change all that much.
All right, John, you keep referring to Taiwan, but what about Hong Kong? Should we be worried about what's occurring in Hong Kong?
Yes, I don't know about it. We'd be worried about it. It was a stupid policy, it seems to me, on the part of the Chinese. What has happened is they're digging themselves into a hole. And maybe they'll survive it, or maybe the Chinese people will say, well, I don't care about we're in a hole. It's better be in a hole than be in a war, for example. They're almost paranoid about secessionist movements, not in Hong Kong and also on the other end in Xinjiang. And they see it as an existential threat. And even if you say to them, this is going to hamper economic growth, which it more or less will, they'll say it's worth it because what's most important in the world is to keep the Communist Party in control, no matter how kleptocratic, no matter how antiquated it is. And that's their choice. I don't think that's a very wise choice. I think it's going to hamper economic growth in the future. They're doing almost everything wrong from the standpoint of developing economically. They should be liberalizing rather than the reverse. But I don't see that as a threat. I think that something's going on there. We should watch it. It's certainly reasonable to criticize them on the civil rights area. We should also, however, be criticizing other countries like Saudi Arabia, which we don't do with the same amount of alacrity, it seems, as the Chinese.
Yes, and a subheading in your article points to the alienation of foreign firms. And you refer to scholars like Finger and Oy. And let me read an excerpt. China's authoritarian crackdown in Hong Kong, a region that once supported an attractive openness and a court system that was not corrupt, is scarcely likely to encourage international confidence and investment. Its rankings from least to most for 179 countries in 2019 found that for what might be called Chinese entities, Singapore ranked at 4, Hong Kong at 16, Taiwan at 28, and China at 80. As one business executive puts it, businesses will inevitably change their perceptions of Hong Kong as a gateway to China that is protected by rule of law. There will be foreign companies that say, we'll just enter China directly. I've got no one up going via Hong Kong, or they'll just exit China completely. And recently, The Economist magazine also had a feature on Xi Jinping's perceived assault on the IT sector in China.
Yes, well, I don't know what's going to happen in the future on that issue. People do make those arguments that I quote there. In general, people are going to deal more warily economically with China. A lot of that, by the way, has to do just simply with they've got so many Byzantine restrictions on the economy, and you have to work through that. And so consequently, it means that if you do invest in China, you have to demand a higher rate of return to cover that, which is not very good from China's standpoint. China remains very much a trading state, very much part of the international economy, and investor confidence is a very important part of that. Right now, I think it's in decline, particularly because of the Hong Kong situation. Some companies are going to be able to readjust, other countries will not. But China still remains an astoundingly big market. It's got a middle class that's bigger quantitatively than the United States. If you're selling stuff to the middle class, that's really, really interesting. And you're probably willing, as a business person, to jump a large number of hurdles to get inside that. So that'll continue.
Exactly. But John, based on your articles and what I've been reading, I think that Americans should fear a China that is declining in terms of economic potential, because as we established earlier, China purchases American goods, African goods. Well, China is basically a major producer of goods and importer of goods and services. So if the economy of China is not conducing free market and innovation, then this portends a problem for us in the West who rely on countries to grow and succeed, because economic growth is not a zero-sum game. When one country performs, we all do well. So I think that this is the new fear, not the rise of China, but the somewhat decline.
Yes, I think that's probably true, and we'll have to see how it comes out. The calculations don't change. If a country starts adopting a lot of bad policies, other countries stop investing in it. That's what a lot of countries have that problem. And if China now becomes a less pleasant place to be, Some of it, by the way, is just like surveillance. If I talk to people who've been there for decades and working in China, they love China, and they basically they have left because they couldn't stand constantly being watched by the secret police. It was obvious it was going on everywhere they went. They just couldn't. They just didn't want to live that kind of life. They were not being persecuted or thrown in jail or even stopped for questioning. So that kind of atmosphere, one in which you're not free and you can't be yourself, is not one where you want to send people. Or another way of putting it is that if you do send people to work on a business in China, you have to pay them more money because they have to be willing to not only do the work, but also to suffer these unpleasant consequences. It's sort of like combat pay. So that means it costs more to invest in China if you're an outside firm. So these are all straightforward economic issues. They're not new. They're certainly not confined to China, but they're quite important. And we'll have to see how big the degree, how much difference they make overall in investor confidence.
John, can China reconcile political illiberalism with economic freedom? Matt Ridley seems to think so. He argues that economic freedom is not a problem in China and that the economy is relatively free as long as you're not challenging the status quo. But for how long will this system be maintained? I don't share the assumptions of Matt Ridley.
Yeah, well, in terms of the economy, they're making it much more restrictive. They now just recently, in the last year or so, have demanded that every firm have on it in its board a Communist Party representative who probably accept bribes and so forth, like the other ones do. And so therefore, they want to make sure that any government that businesses are not taking too big a risk, as if they know exactly what risk would be. They know better than the individual company. So they're making a whole lot of things like that. They're basically tamping down on innovation, on a willingness to take risk, which businesses do all the time, and making it more difficult. They've also continued, this SOEs, the state-owned enterprises. They're favoring them because they're afraid that if the SOEs fall apart, which they should because they're wildly inefficient, they'll have a huge unemployment problem to deal with, and that would be not good for the security of the Communist Party. So now it's much more. It's pretty easy to get loans if you're a state-owned enterprise and basically wildly inefficient, but more difficult, increasingly difficult, for private companies to do so, even though they're 5-10 times more productive.
And we can never forget the ghost cities and zombie firms. China has immense excess capacity. The late Alice Amsden, her prophecy is being fulfilled. The Chinese, they got the prices wrong. Alice Amsden, the late economist, so she argued that China was getting prices wrong because they were overinvesting to drive economic growth, and as such, Chinese-led development was not driven by demand and supply. So eventually, growth will peter out.
Yes, that's a very, very common criticism, and as far as I can see, it's sound. China should be going away from that, and it basically is, if anything, going into it. That's becoming increasingly debt-ridden, it may well be able to survive, as I point out in the article. Even if China starts to decline, the Chinese people may say, well, this is better than the alternative, which is some sort of chaotic civil war type situation. And they may also say, well, even no matter what, China is, the standard of living in China is higher than it's ever been in the world, ever, in its whole history, which is true. That's also true, by the way, for almost every other country in the world, except for maybe a dozen or so. There's been economic prosperity emerging and growing throughout the world for the most part, with a few unpleasant exceptions. But anyway, the point is, from the Chinese standpoint, look, this is really better than we've ever had it in the whole, 2,000-3,000 years in terms of standard of living. And if the Chinese Communist Party has lots of defects, but we can maintain more or less that, even if we're not growing as much as we would like to, or we could, we'll live with that rather than face the alternative, which would be a lot of turmoil and disaster potentially, including potentially civil war.
Uh, and I must expound on a point you refer to in relation to the debt burden in China. According to the Economist, fully three-quarters of new loans in China simply go toward paying the interest on existing debt. China has a serious problem. Household liabilities are increasing. Government has serious liabilities, and we have known this for a long time. People like to argue, oh, the Americans owe China a lot of money, but the common retort is that if America was not valuable, people wouldn't want U.S. liabilities. Whereas China's currency is not the reserve of the world, so it doesn't really have a buffer against increasing financial liabilities.
Yes, that's certainly one of the danger signs, the huge debt. There's also an issue of corruption, which is amazingly endemic throughout the country. Has grown very much during the course of this century, in which people are constantly taking bribes or getting loans that they don't have to repay, and manipulating the regulations in various ways to get rich. One guy, there's been a campaign against it, and one guy who was basically arrested at the time of his arrest owned about 350 apartments, had about $100 million in cash in his house, and was maintaining 18 mistresses. So he's very busy. He's now in jail, however. But anyway, the corruption is extensive, and it's extremely hard to see how they can reduce that, even though they're trying. That also means that throughout the economy and throughout particularly the Communist Party, you have people who are profiting extremely well. So if you do try to reform, they're extremely well placed to figure out how to get around it, to manipulate it, or simply not to carry it out. And you mentioned a couple of times about the question about what their numbers mean. And that's a big problem. They seem to lie repeatedly, particularly about what their GDP has been. Just about every economist has looked at it, said, no, this is inflated. And that comes from local reporting, in which the locals get rewarded if they contribute greatly to GDP, and they come up with big numbers. On the other hand, things that are part of GDP, steel production, for example, doesn't seem to go up that much. But they don't have to. That's not the big number. The big number is GDP. So they're lying about it frequently, and that's been going on, juking the stats, as it's frequently called, for a long time, and it does not seem to be getting any better, really.
Let me give some evidence. In a study, a forensic examination of China's national account 2019, the authors note that China's GDP may have been exaggerated by around 2% per year between 2008 and 2016, showing that China's real GDP is probably 18% lower than the official figure.
Yes, that's not at all an unusual calculation. In general, what people tend to do is just take the figures and work with them, because they may be exaggerated, but at least they mean something. But everybody also puts in a footnote or someplace a paragraph saying you can't really believe these numbers very much, and you should probably be downgrading them overall.
Yes, and then remember what Michael Beckley said, that on average, Americans are better off than the Chinese, judging by quality of life measures. And then Derek Scissors did a study showing that when we value American property and other assets, America appears to be more impressive than China.
Yes, I think that's true. Whether that'll change or not, I question. But I don't know if there's any sort of a race thing or why we have to constantly compare ourselves to China.
Exactly.
What the United States should be doing is making itself better off, and getting rid of bad restrictions and bad regulations, and competing. I mean, if China's a competitor, well, then compete. Competition is not a bad thing. If China comes up with a better idea, then pay attention. If they don't.
The Americans need permissionless innovation.
Yeah, there's this, the university system in the United States is infinitely superior to the one there. And innovation generally is really top flight. And the United States owes much of its success to that. So do other Western countries and other countries that are free. And
Yeah,
China basically doesn't. They do a lot of patents. I had a friend whose wife is Chinese. He's a Westerner, an academic, and his wife, who's also an engineer but is Chinese, read an article in a Chinese journal, and it was exactly what he had written. All he'd done was translate the article into Chinese and put his name on it. And my friend, needless to say, was really outraged. But that's very common practice. It doesn't have much to do with innovation, that's for sure.
Americans score higher in intellectual openness than the Chinese, and intellectual autonomy is a robust predictor of innovation. So culture will give America the edge, but to be complemented, culture requires the right regulatory framework. And if America becomes a regulatory state, I do believe that relative to China and other countries, the US will still be more competitive, but in the absence of unnecessary regulation, America will be richer.
Yes, I think that's true. That's a very Cato-esque sort of thing to observe, but yes. Um, but China seems to be going in the wrong direction. The United States more or less in the better direction, freeing up generally. And if Cato has anything to say about it, it'll be even more so. So essentially, the prospects look pretty good. That doesn't mean China is going to fall by the wayside. If it's never going to do anything that's helpful or wise, but nonetheless, it's got the thing to keep in mind is even though it's growing, it has terrific number of problems, many of which you've already talked about: the aging thing, the lack of innovation comparatively, poor education, just incredibly low GDP per capita, increasing inequality, the huge debt problem, and increasing regulations that will stifle business development and innovation.
And in the conversation, you said something interesting about the education system in America being superior to the Chinese system. I don't know if you have been following the news on the issue, John, but there is evidence to suggest that Chinese students cheat in exams.
Yeah, I don't know about that.
Yes, I've seen one person did a review of Lawrence Mead's book, The Burden of Freedom, and he cited reports from the New York Times and other publications. But cheating seems to be a problem in China. So maybe again, we're inflating the academic performance of the Chinese.
I think that's very likely the case. I mean, when obviously this guy who produced this plagiarized article, that was a production in China, and all he did was translate into Chinese. That's not very helpful. I don't know about the situation. People have had Chinese students, graduate students in particular, generally speak quite highly of them. And one of the things, I talked to one person who is in the sciences, who had a large number of Chinese graduate students. And he said, none of them want to go back. Now, these are the privileged, elite children of China, and they all want to stay in the West. All of them, virtually. And he said one guy went back, but he was the worst student ever. So anyway, I don't, it would be interesting to look at that. If they're cheating on exams, there are ways of stopping people from cheating on exams, and one is to flunk them, of course, when you find out. So Americans, cheating happens all over the place. Yes, but it could be, it's certainly endemic in a lot of countries like China, and it's something that professors have to be working on.
John, in your article, there's a subhead entitled "Spying and Stealing." Republicans, they like to press on this issue. Oh, the Chinese are stealing American intellectual property. But is this new? Is it something that we should really care about? Stealing is not unusual throughout history. countries stole from each other. The British copied foreign technologies. The French and the Germans copied the technologies of the British. Is this something we should really worry about?
No, well, I mean, obviously, if your secrets are being stolen, you're losing money. You want to you complain about it. If you put out a movie and they play and they duplicate it and don't pay you any money, that's a legitimate concern. But spying on other countries' economic and then economies, and then trying to help your own businesses is an age-old thing. Actually, a classic example is Chinese, anti-Chinese. About 400 years ago, a bunch of monks who were visiting China stole silkworms, brought them
From
back to Turkey.
Nestoria, the Nestorian monks.
The Nestorian monks, yes. They brought it back to someplace, I think Turkey, and broke the Chinese monopoly on silk. So, I mean, that stuff goes on all the time. The United States does it all the time. And according to some evidence that I present in the paper, the only country in the world in which the intellectual secrecy, business secrets are not given to the locals is the United States. And from my standpoint, I must say, as a taxpayer, I think that's a good thing. If I must pay a lot of money for intelligence, I don't want to spend it on spies that then simply steal intellectual, economic secrets and give them to American firms. That's not what I think intelligence is about. But every country in the world, apparently, outside of the United States, does that. I was sort of amazed to find that, but it seems to be true.
Yeah, and let me cite the data. As Johnston points out, the United States has been the only major power to make a clear normative distinction between the legitimacy of cyber-enabled political military espionage and the illegitimacy of cyber-enabled commercial espionage. China then is following the dominant behavioral norm on cyber commercial espionage. And it is the United States that is the outlier.
Yes, that's right. The United States is the one that's not following the custom of the world. I hope more people will follow the example, but we'll have to see.
John, activists in the West like to decry pollution, but as a student, I was literally in high school, it became evident to me that pollution is a bigger problem in China. And your article notes, air pollution kills over 1.5 million Chinese each year. Barry Norton of the University of California at San Diego points out that although China has 19% of the world's population, it incurs 30% of the health costs, and this might increase as the population ages. A healthy population is a successful population, John, and the productive population.
Yeah, I think it's really a scandal. All those people dying that time. I happen to be the world's foremost authority on pollution. It's not because I ever took a course in it or read a book about it, but because I grew up in Los Angeles. I can assure you, I know what smog is like. And there is none there now. I go back frequently. And mountains I never saw when I was a child are now very visible. So it is solvable. And everybody else who grew up in Los Angeles when I grew up is also the world's foremost authority on air pollution. And a friend of mine was in China about 40 years ago, and he visited a friend in Beijing, and then took a train down to Shanghai, and did the tourist thing. And he said he sat by a window on the train, and all the way down, he couldn't see anything. It was all gray out there. Pollution kills big time, as you pointed out, and the Chinese should be spending a lot more money on it. It is, when you ask the Chinese people what are big problems in our country, the two that come up most are corruption and air pollution, also water pollution, general and environmental degradation.
And China is demonstrating the superiority of free market systems compared to planned systems in real time. Wealthy free market countries are able to afford the cost of regulations. Countries like China with planned economies are in a hurry to growth, and as such, they may ignore important policies that are able to prevent pollution. And even without the regulation dichotomy, we have known for a long time that on average, Western free market economies are less polluted than economies in the East. So, for example, in the 1980s, the economies of the West were less polluted than the Soviet economies. And China is a brilliant contemporary case study.
Yeah, it's a major problem. But again, I mean, California continues to be extremely productive. It is spending a lot more money on pollution, but they're also spending a lot less money on sick people in hospitals. So a lot of that, some of that came out of free market, but it also came out of regulation, requirement of catalytic converters on automobiles and stuff like that. And that's the problem. If I could live through in Los Angeles, I still remember that I couldn't go out in the schoolyard. If you took a deep breath, you couldn't exhale without coughing. I still remember that extremely well. But Los Angeles, California generally, and for that matter, much of the rest of the country is solved the problem. The United States is spending a lot of money on it. It's still quite rich, so it hasn't hampered its economic growth very much. And it's been, from a human standpoint, it's been overwhelmingly worth it.
John, some submit that Xi Jinping is appealing. So, for example, Harvard Business Review recently published an article titled "What the West Doesn't Get About China," something to that effect. And the writers argue that the political system in China is different, and people appreciate Chinese politics because politics in China has delivered. And when they compare China to the West, they see chaos in the West. But Nicholas Lardy has a statement that's quite poignant and it challenges some of these assertions. Nicholas Lardy, and this statement is from your article. Nicholas Lardy, a specialist on the Chinese economy, strongly agrees and elaborates. She fears that reforms could trigger social unrest, unemployment, financial instability, and loss of support among crucial vested interests, particularly local party and government officials and top managers in China's state-owned enterprises. Lardy finds the concerns about social unrest to be a bit puzzling, pointing out that reforms in the 90s caused a loss of 37 million job cuts, but did not lead to massive labor unrest. But reforms in this age will be different from reformed in the 90s, and for obvious reasons. The rise of social media, the world is more connected, and middle class people in China have different aspirations. They're able to use the West and other places as a metric to show them how middle class people do live and their role in the political system. So maybe this time around the Chinese should actually fear the consequences of some reforms.
Yeah, well, as that Lardy quote indicates, there has been big unemployment at times in China, and it hasn't led to big unrest. But they're very paranoid. That's what they're worried about more than anything else. The rise of discontent among the population. Now, the population, as I mentioned earlier, thinks that pollution and corruption are the two biggest problems in China. Therefore, they expect the government to do something about it. The government is working on both those problems, but it's not clear that it's making much progress overall. If the Chinese become discontented about that, they will probably say so, particularly the middle class, which is what they're particularly worried about. But again, as I said, from a Chinese standpoint, we're living in the best time we've ever had, no matter what. Even if it gets worse, it's going to be a lot better than for forever, pretty much. And we start having a lot of chaos. By the way, I was hearing this from Chinese going back to the 1980s. It's not a new thing. If we have chaos, then the danger is that all this will fall apart and it'll become like Yugoslavia or something like that. They just can't, and so consequently, they may be willing to acquiesce to whatever the government continues to do. They certainly want to be proud of their country. And if the country seems to be swinging its weight nicely in the international arena, giving a good Olympics, for example, then that's one of the things that'll make them happy. And trying to change it is very, very difficult. And the fear would be that it would actually collapse, sort of like what's happening in Afghanistan or something. So consequently, it doesn't follow that even if China starts to decline, even declines considerably, that there'll be a huge outrage among the Chinese people for those reasons.
There are observable limits to the rise of China, and we cannot discuss these limits without mentioning China. On the one hand, people in China clamor for more freedoms, but historically, China has been closer to collectivism on the spectrum. So it's really difficult to see how they will reconcile their desire for greater freedoms with collectivism and long-term stability. Based on my reading of history, the Chinese have an inclination to prefer stability to disruptive reforms. Even ordinary people subscribe to this notion. So innately, are the Chinese putting a cap on their own development? This is
Yes, that's the danger. Because they're so afraid of this. What could have happened and was happening was gradual liberalization, particularly economically, but also politically. Elections at the local level, and then have them rise up to higher levels and so forth. But the danger would be that eventually they'd vote the Communist Party out. And that's something the Communist Party simply couldn't tolerate. In terms of the economy, plenty of Chinese economists have been saying for decades, okay, we've got, this is pretty good so far. Now we need to, because they obviously have liberalized their economy since the disastrous days of Mao Zedong. And we just need to continue it. One of the things you want to do, everybody agrees, is reduce the number of state-owned enterprises. They're wildly inefficient. Well, you don't have to close them down overnight, but you can slowly crimp them down, for example. You could reduce some regulations. You could free up the economy gradually, potentially without changing all that much in terms of overall civil liberties, and that would be wise. And many Chinese economists, including Communist Party ones in the past, have said that. They're not saying that very much anymore. And people who do say that, by the way, are being expelled from the party or even being thrown in jail. So the reformers are being within the party, of which there are a considerable number, are becoming increasingly quiet, because to speak out is dangerous, and that's not good for China economically.
But China also should create a platform for the free influx of controversial ideas. And Elizabeth economy is quite cogent in our discussion of the matter. And she writes, this is also from your article: by enhancing the role of the state and diminishing the role of the market in the political and economic system, as well as by seeking to limit the influence of foreign ideas and economic competition, the leadership has deprived itself of important feedback mechanisms from the market, civil society, and international actors. The state is precluding intellectuals from accessing some Western materials, and a part of economic growth is disruption. Innovation is a trial and error process, and it is disruptive. People don't like innovation. It upends the status quo.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Basically, you have to take a risk. A certain amount of chaos is necessary. Bankruptcy, in particular. What's happening is that firms are frequently not allowed to go bankrupt. The state props them up, and they become. There's a standard. The phrase you used earlier: zombie enterprises. These are walking dead. In many cases, so the state-owned enterprises like that. They should be dead. They should be bankrupt. That's one of the great things about capitalism. If you fail, you fail. And then maybe you pick yourself up and you try to do something else, invent something else, and maybe that does work. Your restaurant fails, so you open up another one in the suburbs, maybe, who knows, whatever. A product you think everybody's going to want, nobody wants. Well, then stop making it. But that's not happening. And so the palliative of bankruptcy is not being very much accepted. The Chinese even have, one of the economists you pointed out, mentioned earlier, points this out. they have gone into venture capitalism. And so they're looking around to find out people who have good ideas, they think, and then funding them. And if they work, they fund them more. Okay, that's great. But venture capitalism means if they don't work, you pull your money out. And they don't do that. They keep, if they do work, they keep funding them. If they don't work, they keep funding them. And so that goes against the whole idea of venture capitalism. There's no venture, and it isn't really capitalism.
And the private sector is more adept at allocating resources than the public sector. So on average, private venture funds do better than public venture funds. Furthermore, over 97% of startup founders will never get venture capital. Venture capitalists want to make money. It is not a sentimental business. And when the state intrudes into this arena, it often acts in a sentimental manner. And this is one of the reasons why state-led venture capital is often unsuccessful.
Well, China is a poster child for that.
Yeah, the Chinese are misallocating resources. We are able to see some of the minute benefits of state-led venture capital in China, but what about the unseen costs?
Yeah, well, those are many of the things we've talked about already. And that's why I think it may be in for a period of demise, or at least reduced growth. We'll have to see if that happens.
Exactly. And before we begin to talk about your book, this is our last point on China. The Chinese want to replace America as the world's technological superpower, but IT companies are disruptive, and China is aiming to control the IT sector. So again, the Chinese are imposing constraints on their growth.
Yes. Trying
Yes.
to control the whole, Alibaba, for example, now the guy's in jail practically, yes. And that's
Exactly.
just not wise. That's just not wise.
And Alibaba is one of China's better companies. But now we're going to talk about your book, The Stupidity of War, American Foreign Policy and the Case for Complacency. Give us a summary and talk about some of the main points.
Well, the main point is looking at the idea that war is really stupid, which you wouldn't hear very much before World War I in Europe and North America. But after the war, the idea was totally accepted. And what we've done now over the last century is to move to a position in which international war, not all war, but international war is becoming pretty much obsolete. It happens very little in this century. There's only been 3 or 4 wars this whole century, 21 years of wars. And 2 of those were by the United States, starting the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq. But mostly what's happening is countries are now not using war as a way of solving their problems. They sometimes use economic sanctions. They sometimes intervene in civil wars. They do a bunch of other things, which may be unseemly in many ways. They also have border conflicts in which they seize tiny pieces of territory and so forth, but they don't go to international war. And I think that's a major change. And the book then tries to look at the current threats, and it seems that there aren't any of an international war: Russia, China, Iran, nuclear proliferation, terrorism, and so forth. Argues that we can be complacent about these. We should worry about them. They are problems, but they are not ones that we have to do a whole lot about, and probably cannot do a whole lot about.
And wars are also expensive, John. They tend to benefit the military-industrial complex. So, for example, I don't lament America's decision to exit Afghanistan.
Yeah, I lament its decision to go in the first place. It's a disaster, and incredibly costly, of course, and stupid, as is the war in Iraq.
Yes, wars are rarely fruitful, and many war leaders who we deem to be great men were actually warmongers who went out of their way to foment political tensions. Ralph Rico has an excellent book on the topic titled Great Leaders and Great Wars. And in it, Winston Churchill is destroyed.
Oh, yes. Right.
Yes, Winston Churchill.
Yeah,
But
he was one of the people who sort of loved war, right?
yeah,
They
yes.
loved doing it, at least. He did try to keep it from happening. But
Even as a little boy, he enjoyed war. Winston Churchill was a warmonger in every sense of the word. But John, I
well,
enjoy.
when he was a boy, by the way, before World War One, it was common for intellectuals to say war, meaning international war, basically. War is wonderful. It's beautiful. It's redemptive. It's cleansing. It's progressive. It's sacred. And peace, by contrast, is decadent, effeminate, cowardly, self-interested, and basically people living in bovine content, like cows.
Yes.
So when he was saying a lot of that stuff was back in that period. It's very hard to see people, including Churchill for that matter, really saying that after World War One. So that was a huge change, which I just deal with a lot in the book.
Yes. So John, it was a pleasure to have this conversation, but unfortunately, I have to wrap up. So bye, and thanks for coming.
Okay, thanks. Great to be here. Keep in touch.
All right. Yes, we will keep in touch. All right. Bye.